Right. Welcome, everybody, to this video about the IRTP Part D working group. I'm here with the two co-chairs, James Bladel and Mikey O'Connor, who have kindly joined me to walk us through the various charter questions and recommendations that the group has come up with over the past year. And to start off, I'm going to pass over to James, who will give us a brief background on IRTP and why it is actually quite an important policy. James, over to you.
Thank you, Lars, and hello, Mikey. I just wanted to mention that the IRTP, while it may not be the most exciting policy to work on in ICANN, it is incredibly important as it is a cornerstone of the competitive marketplace. The ability to transfer a domain name from one registrar to another gives consumers choice of service provider and allows registrars to compete freely for those customers. This is the fourth, by the name IRTPD. This is the fourth in a series of PDPs that were launched to address and reform some of the elements of this now 10-year-old policy. The IRTP is the single source, the largest source of complaints from the general public to ICANN by far. So addressing some of these issues, particularly with regard to disputes or failed transfers, is critical in order to maintain trust in this marketplace and preserving consumer choice.
Okay. James, thank you very much for that overview. Okay, I will pass it on to Mikey, our other co-chair, who's going to start us off with the first charter question. Mikey, over to you.
The first charter question, I'll just read it. It's whether reporting requirements for registries and dispute resolution providers should be developed in order to make precedent and trend information available to the community and allow reference to past cases in dispute submissions. And just to make a little bit of an aside, this is a lot like the way that the UDRP works right now, which is another cornerstone policy. And this question, all these questions were formulated way back in like 2007 and 8. So as we get a little further into this, you're going to realize that some of these questions have already been addressed. But this one's one that we did feel a change would be in order, and we have two recommendations. First of all, we recommend that there be reporting requirements. And then the second is that we recommend that the TDRP be amended to include language along the lines of this revised version of the UDRP that assure publication of the outcome of TDRP cases. In most cases, TDRP outcomes are published, but we wanted to put that into the rules. And I think that's sort of the highlights of that one. Not too terribly exciting. James, you want to add anything on to that?
Thanks, Mike. You covered that well. I think that this one was fairly controversial. During the course of this particular PDP, we found that there was somewhat of a dearth of information, the outcomes and the standards that were applied, not only by the dispute resolution providers, but also by the registries who are acting as the first level. So by putting some reporting requirements into the policy, I think it will help inform not only future policy work in this area, but also will provide what Mikey described there as a base of precedent for future disputes.
Thank you, James, for that final word on the first charter question. I'm going to pass it back on to you right away for the second charter question, which deals with the problem of multiple transfers, I believe.
Yes, thanks, Lars. And we discussed this fairly extensively in the working group. The concept that a transfer could occur between multiple registrars or multiple hops. Sometimes this is referred to in the industry as domain name laundering, and is often, not always, but often the hallmark of a domain name that has been hijacked and is attempting to evade reversal of the fraudulent or incomplete transfer. And the working group made a couple of preliminary recommendations here. The first one being that if there is a chain of transfers, if the first transfer was not done correctly or was done fraudulently, that the entire chain would be undone, and that the domain name would go from its current registrar of record back to the original registrar at the time of the first bad transfer. And secondly, we are recommending that we extend the statute of limitations on how long from that first questionable transfer from 6 months to 12 months. And this is to reflect, I think, just some general behaviors that we're seeing in the industry. And finally, we're recommending that during this whole process, anytime a dispute or TDRP is initiated, that the domain name be locked against future transfers to prevent from flight to another registrar. I know that this one in particular we want to draw some community attention to, so I'll turn it over to Mikey to highlight some of our discussions on these recommendations, and one in particular.
Thanks, James. Absolutely. This is probably we certainly worked the hardest on this. This is one of the oldest issues. I think this is one of the very earliest reports from the SSAC talking about domain name hijacking and stuff to do to mitigate that. So this one really feels like a long time coming, and we worked really hard on it, and I think we're all pretty pleased with the result. As with many other things, a lot of time has passed, and a lot of mitigation has been done independently of policy. And so the domain name hijacking arena is a bit different, but there are some things that we felt pretty strongly we could help with here. I think the statute of limitations one is the one that we probably agree we want to highlight, especially to the community for input, review. We think this is a pretty good idea. I think that one of the goals that we have in the working group is essentially to slow this process down, make it more visible. And if you look back through all the other IRTPs, we've actually been working on this issue all along. One of the best examples is the emergency action channel that came out of IRTP B, I think, where we've put in policy actions that sort of require registrars to talk to each other. And all of these are really aimed at this underlying issue of domain name hijacking followed by laundering. And especially this one where we edge out the statute of limitations on the transfer dispute resolution policy from 6 months to 12 is another piece in the slow this down a bit process. So from the sort of registrant, internet service provider, security, stability, resiliency standpoint, I'm pretty keen on these recommendations.
Mikey, thank you very much for that. Mikey and James, thank you very much for that overview. I'll pass it back to Mikey to talk about the third charter question, which is about the TDRP and whether to open it to registrants. Mikey.
Thanks, Lars. This is another one that's been a long time coming, and I have to admit that my view changed a bit on this one. Ever since way back in 2008 when we wrote these questions, I've been thinking, yeah, dang nabbit, why can't registrants initiate this when they're confronted by a recalcitrant registrar that just won't take up their banner? And so this is interesting. So here's the charter question. The question is whether dispute options for registrants should be developed and implemented as part of the policy. And then parenthetically it says, registrants currently depend on registrars to initiate a dispute on their behalf. And interestingly enough, the working group recommends that we not do that. And since I'm the registrant type guy on this call, let me explain what's going on there. Basically, registrants have several options to pursue disputes already. But one of the options that they don't have is to launch a transfer dispute resolution policy process. And the reason that we are not recommending that that be made available to registrants is because that process is really aimed at resolving a dispute between registrars. And if we inject the registrants into that process, it breaks it, basically. So what we are saying instead is that we wait, and that at least in terms of the current IRTP and the current TDRP, that registrants can't kick those off. The other recommendation we are making, though, is that we're referring back to the last IRTP, IRTP-C, where we came up with the idea of an inter-registrant transfer as opposed to an inter-registrar transfer. And that recommendation is being implemented right now as we speak. And we aimed this other recommendation at that implementation process and said that the IRTP-C inter-registrant transfer recommendation implementation should include appropriate dispute resolution mechanisms, and that if it doesn't, that we should launch another issue report to get that squared away in policy. But that by giving registrants access to what is really an inter-registrar process, we overload that process. And the working group doesn't think that's a good idea. Now, the third recommendation that we made is that right now the TDRP is a two-layer process. The first layer is the dispute between registrars is resolved by the registry. And then if that doesn't work out, the second level is taken to a dispute resolution provider. Times have changed. Back when this policy was written, there really were very few registry providers. And now, especially with the introduction of new GTLDs, there are going to be a lot of registry providers. At the same time, there are not very many TDRPs. I think the grand total is something on the order of 70. And it seems unreasonable to require every single registry to put in place a dispute resolution process that may never get used, or if it does get used, it's not going to get used very much. And so we're recommending that that layer be removed. Now, the group is pretty firm on that recommendation. We certainly want to hear from the community about that. What we're not quite so firm about is exactly how that works. So, for example, who pays if we take out one whole layer of this process? Right now, the way it works is that the second level is paid for like a dispute resolution process. Should that continue? Should it be changed? How do we mitigate against spurious, frivolous disputes, etc.? We're still really working on that, and we'd really like to hear from the community more on. We're assuming that the community will be okay with taking the layer out, although if you're uncomfortable with that, we certainly want to hear about that too. But what we really want to hear about is the mechanics and the roles and responsibilities and who bears the cost, because we haven't really got that one completely nailed down yet. James, you want to add on to any of all that blather? Sorry I went so long.
Well, thanks, Mikey. No, I think you covered it very well. And just to point out that this charter question consumed quite a bit of the working group's efforts. We spent a lot of time looking at all of the possibilities and all the different ways that we could develop a variation of this policy that was registrant initiated, and we kept running into these sort of deal breakers about what information they might have and what documentation might be available to registrants or authorizations or would be able to be done by the registrar. And so I think, as Mikey pointed out, when we look at this in the context of an inter-registrar process, the registrant really doesn't have all the pieces of the puzzle to make this dispute work. However, when we look at this as an inter-registrant transfer, which we are doing in the implementation of IRTPC, then it does make sense. So decoupling those two issues, the inter-registrar versus inter-registrant, makes more sense. And to your point about removing the first layer of the registries, I think absolutely correct. This is an extremely rare process. I think you said 70 times over the last 10 years it's been used, and that's not an even distribution. There's really only one or two TLDs that have seen any traffic in this policy at all. Most of the registries are really not seeing any disputes. They're either not being filed at the registry level, they're going directly to the second level, or they're taking some of these other avenues. So eliminating the first level, I think, will provide some consistency across the industry in where these disputes are heard and where they're resolved, and the precedents and standards that are used to review those cases for what we admit is an exceedingly rarely used policy. But we are looking for more feedback from the community, particularly, as Mikey mentioned, on the impact that would have towards fee structures.
Okay, I will pass it back on to James, who will summarize the group's thoughts on the fourth charter question. James, back over to you.
Thanks, Lars. So charter question D asks whether the working group should develop requirements or best practices for registrars to make information available for registrants regarding their options to dispute a transfer. And we looked at this quite extensively, and in the context not only of this particular policy, but a number of other policies and the new RAA, which all have requirements or required elements that appear on registrar websites. And I'm thinking, for example, the registrant's benefits statement that is also included, and some information for other policies like the expired name policy. So taking a step back from that, we do believe that it is very difficult to find all of the information and resources from a registrant's point of view necessary to dispute a transfer. And so what we're recommending is that ICANN develop a single information source on its website and make this easily accessible, perhaps even translatable to registrants who need that resource. And then registrars, rather than recreating that information, which could create inconsistencies, registrars will be asked to link to that page, that resource page on the ICANN website. And I think that's the recommendation. It's fairly non-controversial, I think, within the working group, that we would centralize those resources within ICANN and then have registrars link to it.
Thank you, James. Mikey, do you have anything to add at this point?
Yeah, I just want to amplify what James said. From a registrant standpoint, and also as a service provider, the way that the information about how a registrant goes about resolving a dispute is really a mess right now. It's sprinkled across a whole bunch of different ICANN web pages. It's very confusing. It's very technical. It doesn't really offer it in the form of, here are your options. It sort of says, here, become an expert on this policy, and then once you've become an expert on this policy, make choices that are good. And it's like, it's a website that a policy wonk would love, but it's really tough for a registrant who's probably only visiting the ICANN website for the very first time for this particular reason. And so I was even lobbying for above the fold linkage to this on the ICANN homepage. I got shot down by that one. But, I do think that as ICANN evolves, it's wonderful that we're cute and we look nice on the web page and all that stuff. But really, truly, there are an awful lot of users out there in the world who only come to the ICANN web page to get an answer to this question. What are my options when a transfer's gone wrong? And I think that to the extent that this can be made really clear, really good, and really prominent on the ICANN page, and then have the registrars link to it, absolutely, but, do a fabulous job on this on the ICANN webpage, I think is really important. And I'm sort of nudging the perennial redesign the ICANN website processes, because it seems like we redesign it sort of every 3 years, and I'm hoping that these words in this policy will echo in history down to those webpage redesigners so that we never lose sight of how important this is.
Mikey, thank you very much, and James as well. I think we are ready to move on to charter question number E, and I'm passing it on back to Mikey to give us an overview of the group's thoughts on that. Mikey.
Thanks, Lars. This one is asking the question whether existing penalties for policy violations are sufficient, or if additional provisions and penalties for specific violations should be added into the policy. And this is really one of those ones, again, that sort of harkens back to 2007, 2008. Time has passed, and so our recommendations are pretty low key. I'll rattle them off and then I'll put a little wrapper around that. The first recommendation is that no additional penalty provisions be added to the existing policy. We go on to say the penalty structure in the 2009 and especially the 2013 RAA are sufficiently nuanced to deal with IRTP violations. And then we go on to say in the second recommendation here, as a matter of principle, GNSO consensus policy should avoid policy-specific sanctions. Rather, it's desirable that the RAA and RA penalty structures be drafted in such a way that assures uniformity and consistency of policy violation penalties. And really, just to sort of back up from this goes back to two things. One is the contracts have changed a lot, and there's a lot more nuance in the penalty structure than there was before. There was basically nuclear option or nothing in some of the older ones. These newer ones have a more gradated approach. But I think the underlying philosophical thing is that it's a bad idea to wire policies with sanctions. Better to have a sanction structure and then say, if you violated the policy, here's the structure, so that we aren't running the risk of getting things sort of out of sync, inconsistent. It's a lot like the rationale we have for the web page redesign in the last set of recommendations. So again, no changes and keep them consistent. Those are our two thoughts. James, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, thanks, Mikey. This was also fairly non-controversial in the working group. I will echo, as a registrar, the perspective that the 2009 RAA, the 2013 RAA have added, I think, some fairly sophisticated and useful structures for violations of policies and penalty structures, and it's important to keep those separate for consistency. We certainly don't want registrars to pick and choose, hypothetically pick and choose which policies they want to abide by and which policies they want to ignore based on the sanction structure, which is one of the vulnerabilities if those were baked into individual policies. So keeping those two separate is an important principle that we should maintain in the ICANN space. And I agree with you. This is something that is probably an artifact from the age of this policy, using this particular PDP. Current events have overtaken this charter question, and it's no longer relevant.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you so much for that. We're on to the last charter question F, to do with FOAs, and I'm going to pass it over to James to talk about that. James.
Thanks, Lars. Yes, charter question F was added by the previous PDP charter, which was IRTP C, and it asked whether the universal implementation of EPP, which is the protocol that's used to communicate between registries and registrars, has eliminated the need for email forms of authorization, FOAs, for transfers. The working group looked at this, and I think we agreed with the folks from IRTPC, mostly the same group, that the FOA, in the vast majority of cases, the FOA was extraneous and just a little bit of paperwork that needed to be done to confirm the authorization of the transfer. However, we did, at least fairly early on in the process, we did conclude that the FOAs were an essential component if the transfer was ever disputed or needed to be reviewed or reversed. And so having that FOA available for those cases was essential to reviewing any transfers that had gone wrong. So the working group is recommending that FOAs be maintained and that they not be replaced by EPP auth-info codes entirely. However, we recognize that in the most routine cases that those will probably not be used.
Thank you, James. Mikey, would you like to add anything before we wrap it up?
Thanks, Lars. Yeah, I think James did a fabulous job summarizing where we're at, and I just want to add one other thing, which is that FOAs over the years have gotten overloaded in a sort of system sense. Registrars use the FOA for a bunch of different things, not just its original intended purpose. And that was part of the source of a lot of the conversation in IRTPC. And so one of the things that we're really doing here is almost a bit of reverse compatibility, because FOAs are used in unusual ways, and sort of this is my chance in an informal way. This isn't policy, it's not a real big deal, but just a heads up to you registrar type people that you really don't want to be using the FOA for a whole ton of other stuff, just from a system standpoint, because it teetered on the verge of being eliminated, and from an operational and system standpoint, you probably don't want to do that. At the same time, the registries and ICANN compliance were quite strong in their support for the FOA as documentation that's crucial if you ever have to resolve a dispute. And so for that reason, in addition to the reverse compatibility, we kept them.
In fact, both of you, Mikey and James, for taking the time to talking about the working group's recommendations and this initial report. I'd like to close on saying that the group is meeting for a face-to-face community workshop in Singapore next week on the 26th of March at 10:30. And the public comment forum is also open. It remains open throughout the ICANN meeting until the 3rd of April. And then there's a reply period as well. And I believe the working group is aiming at having the final report done by hopefully the London meeting in the summer this year. I think that's it from me. Mikey and James, again, many thanks. And see you
James,
soon.
I think James will join me in saying thanks to you, Lars. You did a spectacular job as our policy staff colleague on this.
Thank you.
We always like to shine a light on the people that do the really heavy lifting, and Lars, of course, did a fabulous job as he always does. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Lars. Thanks, Lars, for the time, and look forward to seeing you both in Singapore. And hope others will come and join us.
Absolutely. Wednesday, 10:30.